Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
This week, highlights and insight from the Senate Judiciary Committee's road trip to Hibbing to hear from Iron Rangers about possible changes to current gun laws. Plus, a look at the extensive reservable space in the Capitol. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. The Senate Judiciary Committee hit the road this week, holding an informational hearing on a half-dozen proposed changes to Minnesota gun laws at the Crown Ballroom in Hibbing. Testifiers spoke for and against proposals like the right to carry a firearm without a permit, the red flag law, and an expansion of criminal background checks to include online and private sales and transfers.
These are the people of St. Louis County, and I'm privileged to represent them. One thing we do have in common, while we might disagree on this bill, is that we do not want firearms in the hands of people who should not possess them. People who have suffered from mental illness, people who have criminal records, people who have followed one of these conditions that are laid out in section 624. We have got a wonderful tool, an existing law. This is not about new laws. This is about giving prosecutors, it's about giving law enforcement people the tool to see to it that the people who should not possess firearms through existing laws do not come into in control of them.
At 8:30 in the morning of January 1st, 8 hours into the new year, to our new decade, the BCA, the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, was sent to Roseau County to assist the sheriff there with one deceased woman who had died from an apparent gunshot wound while she was driving away in her vehicle. She was the first of what I unfortunately believe will be many killed with a gun in a domestic violence case this year. At the Department of Public Safety, unlike my earlier jobs where I was mainly a city cop, I don't just see urban violence anymore. I hear about the double murders in Nevis. 3 women shot, 2 killed, 2 officers shot. I see the 110% increase in guns turned into our state laboratory. 500 more guns than even a few years ago. Guns taken off the streets from folks that were not allowed to have them.
Star Tribune polling shows that 84% of Minnesota's voters support background checks on all gun sales, and a clear majority support stronger gun laws.
Lies, more lies.
Minnesotans want common sense laws that will make their communities safer. And this background check bill will do just that. Under our current system, it is far too easy for people with dangerous histories to buy a gun. Current law does not require unlicensed sellers to run a background check. Criminals can exploit this loophole by purchasing guns from unlicensed sellers. If you can buy a gun from an unlicensed seller, you should have to pass the same criminal background check as someone who buys a gun in a store.
Terrorists, criminals, insane people, they will laugh. They're laughing at us right now. When we're here, they do not think like us. They're the ones that cause the problems, not the people in this room. And I don't care what side you're on. And universal background checks, I mean, they're gonna affect everybody. Democrats, Republicans alike. Democrats are not gonna like going to, and the chief of police going back and forth. I mean, I really think this is a law looking for a problem. I mean, I am proud to be a Minnesotan. I don't want to have laws like California, Massachusetts, these other states.
I find it extraordinary in a time when women are purchasing pistols and semi-automatic rifles in record numbers, joining their local well-armed women groups and filling permit-to-carry classes in our state, that you're proposing legislation which further restricts our access. We are not a threat. My friend should be free to borrow a pistol for the weekend without worrying whether she followed proper procedures for an official transfer under this bill. I should be free to gift a gun to my cousin without filling out a government form. As women, our right to privacy should continue to extend over purchasing and owning tools of self-defense.
Even a commissioner can put as many criminals away as they want. But at what point is the criminal justice system going to take accountability for putting these animals back on the streets? At some point, we're becoming victims. We appreciate law enforcement in my club. We don't have a society without you. But the judicial system has to pick up, and they have to put these guys in jail. When they commit crimes, when they have a long list of violent felonies, and they're back on the street and they get bail just to do it again, who's more likely to commit a crime? Somebody like myself that goes to work every day, or somebody with a long criminal record of violent felonies who's back on the streets without any reprimand at all? They get slaps on the hands and they're back on the streets. Criminals do not do background checks.
Senator Latz also stated this bill in its revised form only applies to pistols and Minnesota's definition of a semi-automatic military-style assault weapon, and I'm using air quotes here under assault weapon, and specifically said it doesn't apply to hunting rifles. Guess what? The most popular deer hunting platform in the state of Minnesota is the AR-15. Hands down, it's not even close compared to other rifles. It's the hunting rifle of my generation. I'm a 45-year-old man who lives in the Twin Cities. It's the hunting platform of millennials, and I would wager for the veterans in the room, it's the hunting rifle they chose because it's based and looks like what they carried in the service.
I'm telling you is this here. It doesn't matter where you go, evil is going to be there. It doesn't matter what you do, evil is going to be there. It doesn't matter if you close your eyes, evil is going to be there. So I'm not saying this here. Until you know how to take the guns away from the thugs, don't tread on me.
After the meeting, I spoke with Committee Chair Warren Limmer and Ranking Minority Member Ron Latz.
Hibbing represents a kind of a nest of sportsmen and rural people that rely on firearms for their protection, usually on a rural aspect, a farm. They use it for hunting, they use it for food even. And we thought that it would be best to come here as kind of a profile of rural Minnesota, outstate Minnesota, to hear from them what they actually think of all of the bills. You know, this issue triggers emotion, and some people see guns as a long-held heritage of hunting. Others see it to protect their children in certain environments. And when someone starts to toy around with that constitutional right, people get emotional. And so it's kind of like riding herd on a stampede at times, but I understand that. And I was just trying to explain and hope that they would understand the formality that we have to go through and to listen to all points of view, which is so vital. We don't do that enough in politics in America today. I don't think a legislative body has ever visited Hibbing in this way. And we decided to bring it here. We wanted to make sure that they understood that their views on this issue, even diverse views, are important for us as policymakers to understand.
Look, the people who came here are the ones who made the effort to be here. That means they felt really passionately about this topic. They feel real passionately about the Second Amendment, and anything that can be perceived as infringing on their complete freedom to do whatever they want with a gun is viewed as an attack on who they are. So they react this way. I don't begrudge them feeling strongly about it. I just wish we could have done it in an environment that was a bit more respectful. And I don't think the people who showed up here reflect the views of the majority of Minnesotans in northern Minnesota. And the Star Tribune poll from April 2018 backs that up 100%, because their poll was done across the state, and they disaggregated the data for greater Minnesota, rural areas as well as metro. And there was 70-80% support in rural Minnesota, greater Minnesota, for screening, background checks. And so I know where the public is on it, but they're not necessarily one-issue voters. The people who are here feel extraordinarily passionate about this, which I respect, but I don't think they reflect the viewpoints, the policy preferences of the people across northern Minnesota.
extensive renovation of the state capitol created additional space for public use. Take a look. As part of the Capitol renovation, an additional 20,000 square feet was added to the already existing 20,000 square feet of public spaces, bringing the grand total to 40,000 square feet of public spaces for the People's House. Curt Yoakum of the Department of Administration joins me here in the Cass Gilbert Library to talk about the east wing of the third floor, which is some of this new gathering space. So, Cass Gilbert Library, what's important to note about this room?
Well, first of all, the library honors Cass Gilbert, who was the designer and the original architect of the Minnesota State Capitol building. St. Paul boy, got his start here in St. Paul doing smaller commissions, and then he got the Capitol Commission. And this really launched him into not only a famous Minnesota career, but a national and international career. After he got done with the Minnesota State Capitol building, he went on to do the Woolworth building in New York City, the United States Supreme Court building, and a couple other state capitals.
We should note that this space right here houses the two portraits that or two paintings that used to hang in the governor's reception room that have some controversy surrounding them. And now people can read panels that kind of explain that history. How is this space used now?
This space, along with a lot of other space on the east wing, third floor of the Capitol, and actually down in the basement of the Capitol, is now reservable by the public. As you mentioned, there's now 40,000 square feet of public space in the Capitol, and you may remember as the Capitol was being restored, it was called the People's House and bringing it back to the People's House. What does that mean to be the People's House? You actually have to have place for people to come and actually use the building for it to be theirs. And all this additional public space is part of returning the Capitol back to the people. Cass Gilbert Library is just one example. So you have a conference room, conference table right behind us that can seat people. You have other sitting areas, but it also gives a context to art of in the Capitol. Like you said, the two paintings that had been considered controversial down in the governor's reception room were brought out, moved up here, but you have panels that actually interpret that, and along with other interpretive panels that really give some background to the art and other perspectives on how the art is viewed in the Capitol.
There are 4 conference spaces of varying size that the public can reserve in this area. How do they make those reservations, and who can make those reservations?
Everybody can reserve space here at the Capitol, and we really do want a broad cross-section of people utilizing this space because this really is public space. So you can either go to admin's website, mn.gov/admin, or you can call our service line at 651-201-2300, and you can reserve these spaces. And these spaces are free of charge during normal business hours to use, and then after hours, because of security in the building and other costs, there will be an hourly cost related to those. But community groups are encouraged to use those. This is a great opportunity during legislative session for folks, especially folks who are bringing bigger groups in, to meet with their legislators. But then in addition to that, this really is a citizens legislature, and that means not only do you have citizen legislators, but the people who are actually up here advocating or speaking on legislation are citizens, and a lot of them don't have offices anywhere near the Capitol, and so this provides some space in between legislative hearings, meetings with legislators, or meetings with the media to sit down and actually do some work, recharge, or take a break in between all those meetings. So this is, especially during the legislative session, this is very widely used space.
There's also a business center on this floor. What is that used for?
That is a great opportunity for folks to come in, charge their computers, charge their phones in between hearings. It's a great opportunity for them to have workspace, but there's also information in there about the hearings that are going on around the Capitol or different meetings that are going on in the Capitol. So it's a great place for folks, especially folks who are up here advocating on an issue but don't have office space around the Capitol. They can take a few minutes there to get work in between their meetings.
There's also a gallery space now on this floor that houses rotating exhibits. I've seen several of them. How are those exhibits chosen, and how long do they generally last?
Well, thanks for that question, Shannon, because one of the great things about all the new public space at the Capitol is the opportunity through artwork to tell the story of Minnesota today. The Capitol has always been, in some ways, a showplace for art in Minnesota. And when the Capitol opened, it had some of the greatest artists known in the country at the time doing art. And we have that opportunity with all this new public space to once again showcase new art and tells the story of Minnesota today. The gallery is the biggest place for that. And what we have is we have a citizen advisory panel that makes recommendations for art that should be displayed there. They actually go out and solicit proposals from Minnesota artists and it's written in statute some of the criteria for how the art should be chosen, but they make recommendations, and then that's forwarded on to the Capitol Preservation Commission to give final approval to those exhibits. But it's really a citizen advisory panel that helps choose some of that art.
So as you mentioned, this area, this East Wing, is a good place to recharge your batteries or to meet with your legislator. But there's also a lot to learn in addition to this space with the panels explaining these paintings that are next to us. There's also room 316, which is a conference room that is reservable, but it explains the Muslim experience in Minnesota since 1880. Also in the hallways, there are panels that are describing the self-governing of the Dakota and the Ojibwe people. Why is it important to have those elements here in this space?
You know, the Capitol is a very unique building. One, it's a working building. You have the legislature in here, you have the governor in here, you have the courts, and then you have all the people, and plus the media all here. So it is an actual functioning, working office building. But then on top of that, it's a museum, and in a lot of ways, it's also an art gallery. And all three of those kind of components come together to help kind of tell the story of Minnesota and Minnesota's future and Minnesota's past. And to have the art exhibits that you just mentioned, it really does help tell the story of Minnesota and celebrate the rich diversity of Minnesota. When the Capitol opened, again, we had some of the greatest artists in America at the time that contributed art to the building, but they really contributed art from a very particular perspective. It really wasn't telling all of Minnesota's history, and it wasn't really celebrating the rich diversity of Minnesota. The exhibit that you mentioned, the Tracks in Snow, the Minnesota Muslim Experience since 1880, you know, that's not something a lot of folks know, that we've had a very extensive Muslim tradition and population in Minnesota going back to the late 1800s. And it's a very important part of Minnesota's culture. It's a great exhibit that's able to tell a little bit about that history. But in addition, in the hallways, as you've seen, there's the exhibit of Why Treaties Matter, and that really tells a very extensive history about the Native American population of Minnesota, their history and their relationship with the state and federal government.
When people come here, what do you hope that they'll take away?
What we really hope that they take away is that this truly is their building and that they're not visitors here. It's their building, they own it, and we want them to use it, and we want them to participate in what happens in this building.
The Senate Human Services Reform Committee dedicated a meeting to review ways the state can assist with the independence and public employment for Minnesotans with disabilities.
17 years ago, I was at a planning session and the facilitator opened the day and she said, everybody needs to share what their dream for the future for people with disabilities is. And so I said, you know, here's my dream. Right now, we walk into a grocery store in a local neighborhood and we see somebody with an intellectual or developmental disability working there and we say, that is so cool that this place hires people with disabilities. And my dream is that one day in the future, we'll walk into that same grocery store and we'll see somebody with a developmental or intellectual disability working there and we won't think anything at all.
We know that 25% of people in the state of Minnesota live with a disability. That's 1 in 5 live with one. 1 in 10 live with a chronic disability. And accessibility, rather than being an afterthought, we want to see it built in to the employment and built into even meetings. We live in an incredibly ableist society, which means that we favor those that are able-bodied or typical neuro thinkers, right? That is our choice, and we then discriminate against those that don't fall into those pockets.
We also have a tendency to design things for the able-bodied or the neurotypical and forget to include people with disabilities in our design process. So until we get to a point where we can incorporate more universal design, we will always have a need for accommodations.
I pursued formal accommodations so that my adaptations were part of how I perform my work and accepted. While I received some informal accommodations, I also experienced pushback from departmental leadership on basic accommodations such as use of a laptop during training and preferential seating. Without these two accommodations in place, training to perform my new job duties would not have been accessible or useful to me. Fast forwarding a bit, 2 months into the job trial, I could not get my formal accommodations agreed to. This caused me significant stress and compromised my health. As a result, I required medical leave. Informal accommodations in some workplaces might work, but in that job, in that particular culture, informal accommodations reinforced my status as an outsider. I fear that my need for accommodation ultimately compromised my credibility and my reputation as competent.
We have the ability to do better as we do in the silos already, and the only obstacle in our way from having a broader implementation of that success is really a question. It's a simple yes or no. And so, do we support people with disabilities to the best that we are capable of as state? And the question is a question for the soul of Minnesota. Statistics do not tell you the most important truths. It doesn't tell you the stories of really what happens after. And it can't convey the heartbreak, sorrow, and helplessness that we give someone when we fail to recognize their potential and instead dismiss them without an honest chance of success.
Brian Pease of the Minnesota Historical Society offers insight into another state capitol feature in our series, The People's House. Minnesota began a tradition of displaying battle flags after the Battle of Bull Run in 1861. And there was a huge public ceremony in 1905 to bring the battle flags that were in the collection from the old Capitol to the new Capitol in 1905. What have these flags been doing since then?
Well, that's an important part of Minnesota's history in recognizing the Minnesota men's involvement in the Civil War. So by virtue of putting the first battle flag on display in the first Capitol, you set that tradition and that sense of honor and pride to display those flags that these men were dying under as a part of that tradition in Minnesota. So when those old veterans back in 1905 were coming with their flags tightly wrapped around the flagstaff up to this brand new Capitol, this was a great sense of pride and honor because thousands of people came out in this parade to watch, probably for a lot of these men the last time they ever marched under their flag.
The flags were housed in these display cases, all wound up in tatters. And then in the 60s, there was an effort to unfurl them so that you could see them more as they would have been on the battlefield. What was the story behind that?
Yeah, what was happening, you're getting to the centennial of the Civil War in the 1960s. And so if you were to walk by these cases in the 1960s, you would have seen pieces of the flag on the floor in the case. So they were deteriorating. And it didn't help that they were tightly wrapped around those flagstaffs. And so in 1963 and 1964, Tom Welter from St. Paul was hired to conserve the flags. And so he was very innovative. There weren't a lot of people in the United States conserving flags at that time, so he took it upon himself to design a special sewing machine that would put zigzag stitching so you can encapsulate the original silk in between silk crepeline and then keep all the pieces together, and then you could hang it from a flagstaff unfurled so you could start seeing elements of those flags once again revealed.
So you could really see the flag hanging on the pole. But at some point, 2009, I think, they came to look as they look now. What's the story behind that?
What we were doing is we were always looking at the flags, and we could see where the zigs and the zags were taking place in those unfurled flags. You had more separation taking place of the fabric, and it kept all the pieces together, but gravity was really taking a toll. They had been on display for decades, and so you were seeing fading patterns in the kind of the top of the flag. So we really wanted to make sure we preserve these very important artifacts of Minnesota's history. So the Minnesota Historical Society took the lead in conserving the flags, taking them off those flag staffs or the flag poles, and then mounting them flat on specially designed panels. So now we can have those flags on display flat. And I mentioned before, some of those flags had never been seen unfurled before. Well, for probably 150 years, some of these flags had never been seen flat before.
How many flags are in the collection and how often do they rotate?
Yeah, there's 59 that are part of this collection. There's others that are part of the Minnesota Historical Society collection, and we rotate in over time 48 different flags. Some of the flags that are part of the collection are just very small remnants, so there's not really a lot to see, and we want to protect those historic relics, just keep them under darkness as much as possible. So every 8 to 9 months we have 4 new flags that we rotate in. We try to equal the number of regimental flags and national colors. And of the 4 display cases here too, we do have a flag case for the Spanish-American War, because those flags were also transferred to this brand new Capitol in 1905.
I read that some of the bravest men in the Civil War were those that carried the colors. They marched 6 paces in front of their regiment and were basically the steering wheel for their men.
Yeah, it was, for those color bearers, that was a sense of pride and honor, because they were selected among the regiment. They were some of the most popular, the most physical, the most respected men, because you're carrying those flags for a purpose, and that's to protect those flags and to make them very visible during campaigns or battles as you're marching into battle or in battle. And so to carry that color, not only were you helping control the direction of the unit as it's going into battle or retreating out of battle, but you also put yourself as a big target, because each side was trying to shoot down those color bearers, because they were, once again, a communication device. And so for those men fighting around those flags, that's representing their nation. That's what they're fighting for, preserving the Union. Or they're fighting with their regimental color, their state color, fighting for their home, fighting for what they believe is an important part of their participation in the Civil War.
Do you have a favorite flag?
Well, the one behind us is the flag from the 4th Minnesota Infantry Regiment. And as far as we know, this probably saw a lot of service as in their campaign to Vicksburg. And so once again, that flag staff was being held by those color bearers. And you can imagine through all those miles of marching and battles, there's the blood, the stains, the sweat, the tears, the dirt, all that history is part of that story. And so when you look at each of these flags, they might not have seen a lot of service, but they were, important parts of Minnesota's history and what these men were fighting for.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.